Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Developer Express. Become a UI superhero with Dev Express controls and libraries. Deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today. By leveraging your existing knowledge, you can build next-generation touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. You can download your free 30-day trial at dx.hanselminutes.com. That's dx.hanselminutes.com.
From hanselminutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 500. In this episode, Scott talks with Kyle Simpson, aka Getify, about Kyle's series of books entitled You Don't Know JS.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today I'm talking with Getify, also known as Kyle Simpson, the author of a number of really great books about how I don't know JS. In fact, you, the audience, don't know JS. Is that right, Kyle? None of us really know JavaScript?
Including myself. I still don't know it, but I'm trying to help people embrace that notion and not be scared of the fact that there's always more to learn.
That's a pretty bold title for a series of books. I mean, just to basically, you're walking at Barnes & Noble at a bookstore, you pass by a book, there's all sorts of books like Learn JavaScript in 24 Hours, and then you pass the one that just says, you don't know JS.
Yeah, so the title was designed to go along with the tone of the book, and the tone of the book is to gently challenge developers that there are some things that we assume we understand because we have been coding in it for years. I in my job as teaching JavaScript, I see developers that have been at it for a decade, and they've been successful at rolling out what we would, with air quotes, say production quality applications. But when you push on understanding of how those things work, most of them stumble through. Like, I kind of understand Clojure, or I think I know what prototypes are. So they understand just enough of the surface to get things done, which is the great part about JavaScript. We can get a lot done because it is a very low barrier to entry, but it's also its negative side. It's the other edge of the sword because a lot of developers just stop there and never go any further. So the book series, the trainings, everything I've done over the last several years has been dedicated to this notion that we should take those tools as seriously as any other tool that we'd use, which means we should push beyond that surface. We should go into a deeper level of understanding. And as I went through that journey, I realized that I was in that boat, that I didn't know JavaScript. And it's one of those things like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And that was definitely true for me. So that's what rang out with the tone and both the tone and the title of the series.
Is this a problem that's unique to JavaScript because JavaScript has such a low barrier to entry? I mean, I don't remember people thinking of doing this about C.
I think, I'm not sure I would be prepared to call it a unique problem to JavaScript, but certainly it is much more heavily weighted and observable of the JavaScript community. It surfaces itself in things. When I ask a question of a JavaScript audience, I will ask a question like, how many of you have ever opened up and read any part of the JavaScript specification? And I might, in a room of 30 people, get one, maybe two hands of people that just don't really take it that seriously. But if you ask that same question of a room full of C++ developers or Java developers, you'd get most of the hands up because developers in those communities tend to take it more seriously, understanding how something works, not just that it works. So I do think that there's something interesting about how approachable JavaScript is. I think there's an expectation from the industry that what we incentivize is rapid development. Get something done as quickly as possible. And there's so many resources of code pens and gists and other things like that you can just simply grab a snippet, tweak it a little bit, it works, and your boss is happy, and you're going to get raises because you made your boss happy. So what incentive is there really to understand how that thing worked? And I think, again, I don't think that's necessarily unique to JavaScript, but it's certainly much more pronounced in the JavaScript community.
So then it's not as much the language or the design of the language as it's the environment that we happen to live in and the time that we are in and the code pens and the ease of copy paste, the Stack Overflow.
Yeah, it's all of it from even back in the early 2000s when JavaScript was present in the browser, but it wasn't really treated as a serious language. And then we started to see JavaScript frameworks treated a little bit more seriously. As soon as we saw that, what we saw was we added a layer of abstraction where to get something done in JavaScript, you no longer needed to understand the core mechanisms. You just needed to learn the jQuery or the prototype or the Dojo or the YUI. And that's what an entire set of, maybe 2 generations worth of developers really grew up learning, was learn that part and not so much worry about the JavaScript. You were always writing JavaScript. jQuery is JavaScript, but you didn't have to understand what you were writing because it did a lot for you. That simultaneously helped people do a lot of very good, quick coding, but it also insulated them from needing to learn. And when there's no incentive, most developers don't really circle back and push themselves to learn deeper.
Mm-hmm. You just said something as a throwaway statement that kind of hit me hard, like, oh, you're right. You said jQuery is JavaScript. Like, what? I feel like jQuery is one of those things where, of course, it's built on JavaScript. And of course, like, what does that $ thing mean? And why are we hanging stuff off of it? But it feels like it's such a complete layer of putty on top of the language. It's such a clear layer of abstraction that it is treated as its own entity, its own thing.
The interesting thing about jQuery is that it wasn't, at least in my observation, obviously not being part of the core team, I can't super speak to it, but from observation from the outside, jQuery was more about abstracting the bad parts that weren't actually JavaScript anyway. The bad parts of the DOM API, the bad parts of the Events API, the bad parts of the Ajax API. Those were the things that were really difficult to do and were really different cross-browser because those parts were never actually JavaScript itself. They weren't part of the JavaScript specification, so every browser did them slightly differently. And jQuery was designed to fix that problem, but in the process of putting that layer of putty, as you say, over those ugly parts, it also created a layer of abstraction where you for example, you use a function passed to a jQuery method, and you don't even realize that that's a function expression with its own set of closure, and that it may be called multiple times, and it may be changing variables in its surrounding scope. You just gloss over those ideas entirely, when if I take that same developer and take jQuery out of the picture and we talk about a function as a callback with closure, when we talk about those principles, they seem to get it. But when you put it back in the context of jQuery, it's magical to them that that's the same thing. But it really is. It really is just an application of an understanding of JavaScript. The people that wrote jQuery really do understand JavaScript, and they understand it so well that they created a fantastic library. I don't really call it a framework, but a library on top of JavaScript. And generations worth, millions of developers found JavaScript and front-end web development significantly more approachable as a result of that action. I'm a big fan of those things. What I'm not a big fan of is almost the lazy approach that says, because you made me a tool that makes it so easy, that lets me off the hook and I never need to circle back and go deeper.
One of the analogies that I use a lot when I'm talking about like how modern web development works is that of driving an automatic car or a stick shift. And how deep does your understanding of the driving of the car, the getting from point A to point B, go as it relates to how an internal combustion engine works or how a gearbox works? In my relationship, I happen to be the one that can drive a stick. It could have been the other way, doesn't matter. Right. But my wife can't drive a stick. Moreover, she doesn't really understand the revving of the engine and what the automatic is doing as it shifts gears and things like that. She might argue that she simply doesn't need to do that because the automatic transmission is such a perfected thing that, okay. I mean, it would do nothing to enhance her life. So apply that same thing to jQuery and JavaScript. Why should I learn how to drive a manual stick?
That's a fantastic analogy, and I use a similar one with respect to cars, but maybe in a simpler approach. So you've probably heard, and I'm sure the audience has heard, this notion of I don't want to go reinvent my own wheels. Somebody already made a really good wheel, so I'm not going to reinvent the thing. And I completely agree. You shouldn't go around wasting time reinventing new things, except for the fact that reinvention is a really good quote-unquote vehicle for learning. So the way I put this is, I don't want you to reinvent your own wheels, but I do want you to understand how the wheel works before you bolt it onto the car. Simply treating everything as a black box means that you don't actually have mastery over that thing. It is no more different than magic. Arthur C. Clarke is famous for his, among other things, his 3 laws, but his 3rd law, which is most often quoted, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I like to repurpose that slightly and say any sufficiently unlearned technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you treat it as a black box and some sort of voodoo magic thing happens inside of the black box, that's okay, but you need to be aware of the fact that you don't have mastery over that thing. Mm-hmm. No matter how good you are at putting that box in different places, if you don't know how it works, you don't have mastery. So back to the car metaphor, understanding how a combustion engine works is not necessary to drive a car correctly, but it is necessary to claim that you have a mastery over the concept of what a car is. And I think that's the difference between, say, for example, and I hope I'm not painting with too broad a brush here, but I think that may be some of the difference between a developer and an engineer. I like to say that a developer seeks first to solve a problem and then perhaps later understand the problem better, whereas an engineer may reverse those two and seek first to understand the problem and then perhaps solve it later. So when we are faced with the pressure, I've got to get this feature out, my boss just wants it to work, we bolt a wheel onto the car, which is great because I want everybody listening to have great, flourishing careers. I want them to get great jobs. I want you to keep being successful in the industry. But I hope that at some point you sort of circle back to, how did that wheel actually work? What were the properties of it that made it correct? And in that process, you'll learn deeper how wheels work, or you'll learn deeper how a combustion engine works. So you said that you drive a stick and your wife drives an automatic. I'm in your wife's boat. I don't drive a stick, but I do understand the concept of shifting gears is changing things inside of a transmission and moving things around. And I know that the automatic is doing those things for me. So I think I have an understanding enough of this black box that it isn't a black box magic.
So as with all good analogies, we should stretch it absolutely too thin.
Of course.
So this is perfect. But one could argue, though, that is the intent of the driver to get from point A to point B, or is the intent of the driver to create new and more innovative cars?
Yeah.
And I would argue that if you're just trying to drive from point A to point B, there's no scenario where you need to care about wheels. You just need to know it's an effective car. It has 3 wheels. It's got 5. It doesn't matter. It's driving, and I'm getting to point B.
Yeah, so again, let's keep stretching that scenario. When something goes wrong with your car, and you have absolutely no idea how the car works, it's just simply a black box, then you are at the mercy of taking it to some other person who is an expert and saying, please just fix it for me, right? And that's a problem if you call yourself an engineer. If you have something that you literally have no clue what to do, I tell my students all the time, if you do not know how a piece of code works, then you have no hope of understanding why it broke or fixing it. You'll never accidentally exceed your own understanding of this thing. So I think it's really important for us as engineers to take some responsibility to understand. So I don't fix my own cars, but I think I have an understanding enough of them that if there's a problem, I know, oh, that's a problem with my brakes, or oh, that's a problem where my transmission's messed up, it's not shifting correctly, so that I'm not completely at the mercy of somebody else. So in that stretched metaphor, I am using the tools available to me, i.e. a car mechanics shop who I know has the expertise to do something that I don't have expertise on, but I still come to the table with enough of an understanding that I'm not completely lost.
And I think that's where this cements in my mind that this is a fantastic freaking metaphor. As metaphors go, this is solid because, you roll into the mechanic shop and you don't understand, even a cursory understanding of how your car works. You are at the mercy then of that specialist.
Absolutely.
Which I think we've all found ourselves in those situations in building applications where we go as far down the call stack as our knowledge allows us to. We hit that one limit where it's like, all right, I have no idea what's happening. I sure hope that I trust my consultant.
Yeah.
That they won't lie to me.
To circle back to software, just to kind of make this a little more concrete for the listener, if we observe something about the history of programming, we know that programming languages have been organized roughly into generations. So the first generation software was the machine language. The second generation software was assembly. Third generation was the C programming and the variants of C language. The fourth generation, which is where a lot of our listeners will be playing in, the fourth generation of languages are higher level programming languages, of which JavaScript is a great example. There are others, of course. And then even a fifth generation on top of that, more natural language things like SQL or things like that. So if you're playing at the fourth level, the fourth generation of programming languages, as many people do, I think to call yourself a true engineer of that level, if that's your chosen level, maybe you're deeper in the stack or whatever, but if you choose the fourth generation, I think you need to understand all of how the fourth generation works. So if you use an Angular or an Ember or Backbone or whatever, you should be able to open up the source code of every one of those frameworks and know how every single line works so that you make proper decisions about it. You should also have a good working knowledge of the generation below. So if you're working at the fourth generation, you should be a master of the fourth generation and a working knowledge of the one below. And I think that's what makes somebody a solid engineer. So I don't know all of the details of how assembly works, but I have a working knowledge of that and have a working knowledge of C so that when I make a language level decision in JavaScript, I do have some intuition about what it's going to do about allocating and deallocating memory, even though I don't have to do that in my own program. That's what I think makes a good engineer.
That's really good. I like that a lot. There are those multiple levels, and you have to ask yourself how far down the call stack or the layers of abstraction that you want to go. It's funny that you're giving me all this knowledge and information because I think that we're very similar in the way that we express ourselves. I've used the Arthur C. Clarke metaphor before, except I've used it to express that a sufficiently abstract layer of abstraction is indistinguishable from magic.
Sure.
And the example that I gave once, and I think the listeners are probably sick of hearing this, was that one time my wife lost her wedding ring down the drain.
Uh-huh.
And her working knowledge of how the plumbing works, it starts at the faucet and ends at the drain.
Uh-huh.
But my working knowledge ends underneath at the little bendy thing.
The trap.
And then it disappears into a mist. So when I pulled it out of the bendy thing, out of the trap, she thought that was a miracle. She thought that was amazing because in her mind, it was at the sewage treatment plant.
It was already there, yeah. There was nothing
between. So
between.
That's the kind of feeling that you get when you have a problem, you think you're an engineer, and then you meet someone who does have a working knowledge of that layer, that one layer of abstraction farther down, and you're like, that's amazing. Whether they opened WinDBG or some core level debugger, or whether they're looking at some hex code, and it's like watching someone watch The Matrix, and you're like, how do you understand what all those falling symbols mean?
Right.
Those are but it also isn't something that you can learn those things. Like, it may seem scary now, but then you learn that layer, and then it's not scary anymore.
That's exactly right. And I really think that it pays off in the long run to have those deeper understandings of stuff. It's not to say that those abstraction layers that are built within the generations are bad. Abstractions are not bad. They're very good and very effective tools. What's bad is when they're completely painted in some opaque color and you never look under the hood.
Hey folks, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about Raygun and their new product called Pulse. Raygun is an error and crash reporting software provider, and their new product, Pulse, it's a real-time user monitoring product. It gives you performance data and user insights. Lets you understand exactly what's happening when users interact with your software, so you're never left guessing. Raygun provides you with the answers to your performance questions, and they've found over 10 billion, that's billion with a B, bugs in customer apps with their crash reporting product. And now Raygun will help you understand application quality like no one else. Over 30,000 developers worldwide can't be wrong. I use Raygun all the time and I enjoy it very much. You can try it out today with a no-risk 30-day free trial. Start improving your software quality immediately. Try Raygun for free today at raygun.io. every time I look under the hood and let me say this. I'm always blown away by the amount of stuff there is to learn, though. And this is where it gets a little bit overwhelming, because we are kind of sitting at the top of the mountain here, and underneath, the iceberg below is really huge. There's a really talented debugger at Microsoft, and her name is Tess Ferrandez, and she does those kinds of bugs that are so obscure that they make their way up, like first level, second level, third level support, right? She's at the peak of the support. She writes these blog posts that are like, like CSI level of debugging, like where they'll, a fingerprint leads them all the way down the rabbit hole. And it's just like, oh my God, how did you know that? It's completely overwhelming. How do you choose what to know? You said a good working knowledge. When I read Tess's posts, I am left overwhelmed with how much I don't know about how things work.
Yeah. So I guess maybe the difference between me and somebody else that may be listening would just be that when I was fascinated by somebody that knew something that I didn't, instead of just taking that at face value, that presented me with a question. So I followed that question. And maybe what was different is that answer to that question asked another question. And instead of stopping and taking that one at face value, I just kept asking more questions. When I was dealing with JavaScript and I decided to write that book series, the You Don't Know JS series, I started with a basic set of principles that I understood, but I didn't know why they worked that way. I just knew how they worked. And I wanted to know why they worked that way. So I asked, why does this work that way? Why does this work that way? Why does this statement do that? Why does closure work? Why does the object prototype chain work? And each one of those questions led to another set of questions, and I just didn't stop. And to be honest, to this day, I haven't stopped. I keep going down those trails and asking more of those questions.
But devil's advocate a little bit, and I hate that term, and I don't like being devil's advocate. Wouldn't that indicate that you either have a lot of time on your hands or a job that enables you to have that level of curiosity? I think that it might be argued that there are people who are under the gun who don't have the 8 hours to put their head down and learn how, object prototypes work.
Yeah, unquestionably, and I've said this publicly on many occasions, unquestionably, I have an uncommon level of privilege among my peers that I've had the opportunity over the last 4 years to shift my career. Prior to that, I spent 12 years as a developer, so I do get, in small and big companies, consultancies, all that stuff, I do get the pressures of those things, and I like to believe that I haven't lost track of that. I do understand the pressures that exist there. And I have the privilege that 4 years ago I decided to go independent and teach, and teaching affords me that privilege to benefit learning, because you can't teach if you don't learn, and you can't learn if you don't teach, I think. So there's unquestionably that level of privilege there. But I would almost fall back on a kind of a silly statement that I know has been made many, many times before me, but you might say, well, what if I don't have time to learn this thing? That's the question on everybody's mind. What if I don't really have time to learn it? What if you don't have time not to learn it? I mean, my approach here is I'm trying to help people learn, not just for the sake of being an academic, but because in the deeper learning, you become a more effective engineer. And it takes you less time to fix problems when you understand the code first. And you write better, more performant code the first time when you have the instinct based upon actual understanding, and not just based upon, well, I've stubbed my toe in enough of these places that I know not where to walk. I know where not to walk. If you can turn on the lights and understand the layout of the room and not just stumble around, you will effectively do that path better. So a path to being a better engineer inevitably involves being a path to being a better learner. And to be a learner means to also, you don't know something until you can teach other people. So teaching through, whether that's writing about things or going to local meetups or being a conference speaker or being a book author, whatever those things are, learn something a little bit deeper. And that doesn't mean that learning should ever get in the way of doing your job. You've got to get a paycheck. You've got to be a doer. But take those extra moments wherever you can find them and say, I don't want to leave that thing behind. I want to circle back and figure it out more deeply.
And that is a conscious decision that I am hearing you encourage people to make.
Not only a conscious decision, but a challenge that I put to everyone to say, isn't that what distinguishes us? Isn't that what will keep you fresher in the industry? If you have that uncommon level of asking why and making the sacrifice to go and learn something a little bit more deeply than you understood. You may not have to go write an entire book about it, but
Right.
you should go and learn it more deeply than what you understood the first time you did it.
So let's challenge ourselves a little bit in this discussion to understand that people who are listening might be hearing words like sacrifice, challenge yourself, and they may be thinking that Kyle is asking them to stay up late and spend less time with their kids, and that they're not really an engineer if they really like to go hiking at 5:00, and at 5:01 they like to punch out. I think that maybe one solution would be to force your bosses to give you some training time. Like I used to take Friday afternoons from noon to 5 and just read and study.
Mm-hmm.
And if my boss challenged me, I challenged them back. And I said, listen, I need to do this. And then you get into those kind of discussions with your boss. Like, well, it's on your own time for training. It's like, well, you want me to be effective. And then not everyone has that luxury. How do we enable people to do that?
I think that's an absolutely fantastic point, and I'm glad you redirect it, because I don't want anything that I'm saying to be construed as I'm trying to take you away from your families. I have a family. I have a wife and kids, and my family is incredibly important to me, and the work that I do has me on the road a lot. I'm away from them. When I'm home, I'm very dedicated to my family. So I completely agree and sympathize with people that want to do that. And even if you don't have a family, if it's just that you like to mountain bike, that's great. I want people to have those lives. So I should explain some context. Newly in the position of head of curriculum with MakerSquare, which is an engineer training school, our job is to take people that understand some programming and make them super highly effective engineers that get jobs. And so we work very closely with developers, not just to teach them the raw skills of JavaScript programming, but we work with them to understand what it means to be an effective employee in the workplace. And the challenges that I give the people that graduate from our school are things like, when you get that job 2 or 3 weeks in, after you've kind of learned the lay of the land, you should go to your boss and say, would you let me do a brown bag lunch once a month or once a quarter with my fellow coworkers? And I'll take the initiative to learn something on company time that relates to the work that we're doing as a team. I'll learn it more deeply, and then I will present what I've learned to the rest of my team members. That's an in-context job. You're going with the flow of your job, and you're doing exactly what you said, Scott, of taking time not away from mountain biking or from your family, but taking the time at your job and using it, I think, in ways more effectively, because somebody needs to do that. Somebody needs to challenge everybody to be better at learning, and using, even if it's like the code review process, which, if you're listening, I think you should have a culture of code review at your company. I'm very firmly in that boat. I think code review is really important. But code review, again, is another tool for learning. You set the bar high for what code should be, and when someone more junior to you submits some code in a code review, and maybe they make some mistakes or they use something in a slightly more naive way, instead of just pushing that back and rejecting a code review, it's an opportunity to teach so that everybody is learning. You can do that within the flow of your job without ever having to give up those free moments. Did I sacrifice time away from my family? I absolutely did. But I'm not saying that you have to do that to be an engineer. I'm simply saying you should have the courage to take this challenge to say, how can I learn more effectively through the job that I already have?
Yeah, I think it is a challenge to have that courage, especially if one is in a new job or if one is a junior person, to build themselves up, to have that audacity or that privilege to say, hey boss, you need to let me do this.
Right. But in the same vein, while that does take courage, it's also kind of a measuring stick for the position and the job and the team that you're on, because I believe that a really good company and a really good boss to work for would fall out of their chair excited if they had an employee that said, I want to be uncommonly good at this. I want to learn more deeply, and I want to help everybody around me understand things more deeply so that we're more effective. That's lower total cost of ownership for our software when we write things the right way the first time. And if your boss didn't get excited about that, if they said, it doesn't really matter to us, that's a measuring stick by which you can gauge, am I going to be effective here? Or is there another team? Is there another way that I can be more effective somewhere else? I think that's what will make better industry. I think we can change industry from the inside out by getting more and more people hooked on using our jobs and our job functions as a vehicle for learning.
Very cool. Very cool. And as we end, help me understand the scope of these books. Are these full-sized books? They seem like would I buy a 300-page book on scope and closures, or are these booklets? Give me a sense of what I'm biting off when I decide to buy one of these books on You Don't Know JS.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the book series, there are 6 total books in the series. The very first book is called Up and Going, and that's designed for somebody who's never done any programming before, to literally get up and going and within the context of what JavaScript does. So I talk about functions and comments and variables and values. The book series then launches into the main meat with scope and closures and this and object prototypes and types and grammar and coercion. Those books, each individual book ranges between 100 and 200 pages in length. So they're shorter than your average tech book at 300 or 400 pages each. In total, 6 books, there's 1,100 pages. So there's plenty of information there, but they're in smaller bite-sized chunks. And the goal for that was, whenever I was, learning development years back, I would always go to a bookstore and buy a book that was like 1,200 pages because there was 1 or 2 chapters in that book, 1 or 2 topics that I really wanted. So I'd buy the whole book just for that one piece. I didn't want anybody to be facing that challenge with my set of books. If the thing you really want to understand now is scope and closure, you should be able to buy that 100-page book and have just that to digest. And many people say that they can get through one of these books in the series in an extended weekend, worth of time. So the books are divided that way on purpose. They're very focused on just that one topic. Taken in whole, I think they represent a complete dissertation, if you will, if I can be so bold as to call it that, on what JavaScript, the core language is, and the appropriate ways to apply it. So the 6th and final book in the series is on the new stuff that just landed with ES6, as well as peering beyond, telling a narrative about where JavaScript is headed in its evolution in the future. So you start from the very beginning, and by the end, I think you really do have that solid foundation about what JavaScript is, and then the things you don't know and the things you need to learn better.
Very, very cool. And I will make sure to put links to this stuff in the show notes, and people can read these books online for free. But certainly, I'll have links where you can go and buy those books. And it's also worth pointing out that the Up and Going book, the ebook format is free, which I think is a very nice thing for you to have done for beginners. So people can go and get that right away.
That's true. The entire book series is actually available for free on the GitHub repo. YouDon'tKnowJS.com redirects to the GitHub repo where all the books were written for free, so you can read the entire 1,100-page series for free. They were also professionally edited and published through O'Reilly, and as you said, Scott, the first book of the series, the Up and Going one, because that's the one where I want to be able to get more people in. It's the bridge to getting you into JavaScript. The ebook form itself, the edited ebook form, published form, is free, and the print version is, I think, $4.99. So I specifically said, I don't want any royalties from this. Make it as cheap as you can at cost so that as many people can have access to that book as possible.
Very, very cool. Well, it's been just a joy chatting with you today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks. It's a super huge honor. I have listened to the show a few times before. It's an honor to be here, so thanks for listening.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.